So as Minister of Finance, I'm responsible for Canada's federal finances. I think that role does also include a broader responsibility for the economy as a whole. One of the principal jobs, which is relevant to our discussion today, one of the principal jobs, obviously, of the Department of Finance is preparing a budget every year. That budget is presented in the spring. My second role is as Deputy Prime Minister. That is a more loosely defined role. I would say it means I'm available to do whatever the Prime Minister needs me to do. I maybe am especially involved in areas where I have a particular background or knowledge or expertise. Today and during the period that this covers, that would certainly involve Ukraine and Russia. And I think it does often involve my past as a trade minister and my involvement in the negotiation of the new NAFTA. And then maybe the final thing worth mentioning is, largely, being the finance minister is a big and consuming role, particularly when a budget is being prepared. Being Deputy Prime Minister as well, I feel a particular responsibility when an issue emerges as being of sort of overwhelming national significance, even if it's not specifically in my lane, to start getting involved.
To lean in, essentially,
Yeah.
Well, that leads fairly nicely into my next question, actually, because that dual role you had as Minister of Finance and as Deputy Prime Minister puts you in a unique position to tell us a little bit about the context in which the events that are before the Commission, the Freedom Convoy and the protests occurred. So we spoke about this a bit in your interview, and I'm hoping you can situate in context from your unique perspective what was going on.
Okay, well, I'll try. I'll mostly focus on the economic and financial perspective because that was largely my focus. So all of this started to happen at the end of January. And it's worth bearing in mind, as I said, we were preparing the budget at that point. We were sort of deep in budget preparation mode. And that means that the Department of Finance, I personally, Michael Sabia, we were all really focused on where is the Canadian economy right now and what is our path forward. And I think it's worth reminding people that it was a really challenging time for the Canadian economy. COVID was still very much with us in January. In Ontario, there had been lockdowns, there was virtual school. So we still had COVID with us. We could see beyond it, and we could see that the time was coming to go from a COVID lockdown, really emergency government support for the economy situation, to reopening the economy and doing everything we could to achieve a soft landing for the Canadian economy after the trauma of COVID, the COVID lockdowns, the COVID recession, the economic trauma. That meant that we were particularly focused in the economy on two things. One was supply chains. By now, I think it's sort of become part of the common discourse that supply chains were strained by COVID. It was maybe less apparent to regular Canadians in January of this year, but it was really apparent to us that the peculiar nature of the global economy during COVID had placed some very significant strains on supply chains. That was jeopardizing Canada's recovery from the COVID recession in areas like the lack of semiconductors, putting real stress on our car sector, to give just one example of very specific supply chain problems that we were focused on and thinking about. The second area we were really focused on, which again has moved more into what everyday people are talking about, but we were focused on it already in January, was we could see, partly because of those strained supply chains, that inflation was elevated and rising. And so it was apparent, I think, to us that we were going to be moving from the COVID recession situation, where the challenge was, prevent the greatest downturn since the Great Depression in Canada from really taking hold and scarring the Canadian economy. That had been the preoccupation during COVID. We knew that we were moving into an environment where the challenge was reopening and elevated inflation. And how do you deal with that? And that made us particularly concerned again about the supply chains, because they posed a challenge to elevated inflation. So I would say that was kind of my finance minister budget-related set of concerns. The second economic issue that I was very focused on in November, December, January, was the U.S. Build Back Better legislation, and in particular their proposal on EV incentives. And, I realized to an Ottawa kind of maybe legal community type audience that might seem a little bit esoteric. But the reality is, and it might seem a little bit esoteric and a little bit specific, the EV incentives as proposed by the U.S., and that legislation made its way through the House in the fall in the U.S., I believe in November. That legislation as proposed would have been completely devastating to the future of the Canadian car sector. What the incentives would have done, had they been passed into law as initially proposed, is create very strong incentives for buying electric vehicles that were made in the U.S., not North America, just the U.S. And EVs, that's a nascent industry, right? We're just shifting to the production of EVs. Imagine if you are a car company, and all the car companies that produce cars in Canada operate on both sides of the border. Imagine these powerful U.S. incentives are put in place, but they only apply to EVs and batteries made in the U.S. Are you going to build anything in Canada? Are you going to put any of those production lines in Canada? And the answer is you wouldn't have. And, these incentives, frankly, were quite intentionally designed to drive all of the building of the new fledgling EV industry into the U.S. only, and to create a powerful economic disincentive to build any of that in Canada. That would have been a disaster for us, because EVs are the cars of the future. And to just give you a final kind of sense of how significant this was, at the end of 2021, Marion, the trade minister, and I sent a letter which we made public to the U.S. warning that Canada was prepared to retaliate at scale were this measure to be passed into law. In December, in finance, we were looking at and putting the final touches on a retaliation list, because whenever there is trade retaliation, the first step is you publish the list of things you might retaliate against. We did that during the 232 challenge, shall we say. the 232 tariff challenge. The initial retaliation list that we were looking at was going to include up to $100 billion of U.S. imports into Canada. So that's to give you a sense of the scale that we judged this challenge to be at. Now, we didn't want to do that. We really didn't want a trade war. That would have been terrible for Canada. And so we were also negotiating. And we were talking, all of us, the Prime Minister with President Biden, Mary Ng with the USTR. I was speaking about it with Janet Yellen at the Treasury. And really, the key person emerged as a guy called Brian Deese, who is in the White House. He is the president's economic advisor. And what we were trying to persuade Brian Deese of is the idea that, look, we understand that you want incentives for electric vehicles. We believe in that too. We also believe in the green transition. We understand that you want U.S. workers to benefit from these incentives. But our car sector is very, very closely interconnected. A favorite line that you'll hear every single Canadian trade negotiator who ever has negotiated mention to the Americans on this is a single car part can cross the border 6 times on the way to becoming part of a car. So we say that all the time to the Americans. And so what I said to Brian is, our sectors are totally integrated. We're not asking for a free ride from the U.S. Why don't we match your incentives? And you guys have incentives. We'll have incentives too. And both of us have incentives for North American-made EVs, thus creating a level playing field between Canada and the U.S. And frankly, a strong incentive for investment into Canada, because in that kind of an environment, Canadian-made EVs would be uniquely able to be sold into the U.S. market. So that was what we were talking about precisely at that time. And in the month of December and January, we were drafting these ideas. My department was working on it, and I was sharing them with the Treasury and with Brian Deese. And actually, at the very end of January, my department prepared for me a sort of yet another iteration of this sort of Deese note on how can we coordinate. So that was sort of a second direction of economic concern. I would even say anxiety. We knew we had to make this work, coming at exactly that time. And then the final thing, which was more maybe a deputy prime minister area of focus, was Russia and Ukraine. The war hadn't started yet, but we and our allies started to get intelligence in December and in January that Russia could well be preparing to invade Ukraine. I was briefed directly at the beginning of January that the judgment was this could really happen. And again, it's happened now, so we might not fully remember how astonishing and horrifying that thought was before it actually happened. It's horrifying now too, of course. So, you know, that was a very big deal. I learned about it at the beginning of January, and the threat just kept getting greater and greater and greater. I believe NATO troops were put on alert at the end of January. And then I think the U.S. took this extraordinary step of declassifying its intelligence about Russia's plans in early February to kind of alert everyone. And I was also involved at the finance minister level, working with other finance ministers, talking to the Ukrainians about putting together sort of preemptive sanctions. If you think back to that time, the idea was we would be very explicit with Russia about the sanctions that would snap in the event of an invasion. So we were working on that. So that was kind of a third area I was very aware of. I thought then, and I think today, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which of course did ultimately happen, is the biggest challenge to Canada's national security since the Second World War. I think it's a very serious attack on Western democracies, on the rules-based international order. I took it seriously then, and I believed it was really important for Canada to be in a strong position to be able to respond.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So,
there was a lot going on.
Fair enough. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go over a couple of points and then move on. But so the last point you raised was what was going on in Ukraine. You saw a link to that and Canada's national security. So that link may not be obvious. It's something that's going on in the other end of the world. So what do you mean by that? That would be a risk to Canada's national security.
Well, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the first time that one internationally recognized state has tried to conquer or seize the territory of another since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It's a very grave violation of what I think is one of the greatest accomplishments of the post-World War II international order, which was, a basic understanding that internationally recognized countries don't invade each other and seize each other's territory. Now, that has not been perfectly honored, but if you compare the entire post-World War II period with all of human history prior to that, it's a huge change. And that has hugely enhanced the security of every country in the world. So that's number one. Number two way that Canada's security is threatened, but I think the Allied response has been strong and has strengthened Canada, is I absolutely believe that one of Vladimir Putin's war aims, his principal objective is to crush Ukraine, to take it over, to crush Ukrainians as a people, and to replace the democratically elected government, to make it a puppet satrapy. But he has another objective, which is to show that dictatorships work and democracies don't. There is a broader goal he has in mind, and that is, I believe, in his view, because he wants that demonstration effect. He wants to show Russians, you might not like that much how things work here, but we're better than those, weak, feeble, pathetic Western democracies. That's sort of the message he wants to communicate with what he perceives to be his own strength. And his success, were he to be successful, I absolutely believe would weaken Western democracies writ large, including our own.
Okay. That's, I think, helpful context for if you'll agree with me, for what was in your mind, essentially, as the convoy arrived in late January. You've said that dovetailed, basically, with your negotiations on the electric vehicle incentives. And in the chronology, you can appreciate this is the second last day of the Commission's testimony. So we've been through a lot of the chronology of what happened in those early days. And I want to focus with you this morning on your specific involvement. And I think you've expressed to us in the interview, and you may agree or you may not, but you started to become very actively engaged in this file, in this matter, around February 6th, around the second SSE meeting. Does that ring a bell?
That's the second weekend, right? Is that the Saturday or the Sunday?
That would be the Sunday.
Okay. Yes, that's true. And that's kind of consistent with how I was describing my role. So I would sort of say up until that point, I was pretty much heads down. We have the budget. Budget is sort of 90% of the focus. And then there's electric vehicles over here. Hope we can get a good outcome. Otherwise, it's going to be really bad. And, I've spoken with a lot of conviction a moment ago about the significance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I want to remind us all, at the end of January, beginning of February, it hadn't happened yet. So that was just out there as a threat that I had in mind. So up until February 6th, 90% budget, EVs on one side, worried about Russia, Ukraine, hoping that we can put forward strong sanction ideas that will prevent it. But it was really budget. But then the second weekend of the occupation happened. And I started hearing, particularly from business leaders, that this was starting to be an area of concern. And so I did attend that committee meeting. And then as that week went on, I became more and more and more involved.
Okay. And just to clarify, you wouldn't normally attend an SSE meeting, is that right?
No,
But you
not
had
at all.
A standing invitation as Deputy Prime Minister?
The finance minister has a stand, I think they call it an ad refio member. The finance minister can attend any cabinet committee meeting that she or he chooses to attend.
So on February 6th, you sort of invited yourself.
I think my colleagues also thought it would be good to have me there.
Fair enough. Okay, so soon after that, on February 9th, your department produced an options memo. And Mr. Clerk, if we can just pull that up quickly, it's SSM.can 403764. Okay, so Minister Freeland, we've talked a little bit about this already, but I'd like you to take us through the options and how this memo came about and the two options that are outlined here, which are essentially amendments to, sorry, scroll down a bit, please, Mr. Clerk. The first option that's outlined until you get to, there we go. So would be potential amendments to the PCML TFA Act. And then if we scroll down beyond that, you'll see amendments to the Bank Act. So can you tell us how you perceived these options, how the memo came about, and what you did with this information afterwards?
Sure. And I think, so this was on the 9th, which is the Wednesday.
I believe that's
right. So, and that really was the crucial week from my perspective. And I think the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge began on the Monday of that week.
That's
so from a finance economic perspective, that escalated things exponentially. That's what made it a hugely significant economic action. And, I had started to get really worried on the Sunday. I attended the cabinet committee meeting. Bridge is occupied on the Monday. I start talking very urgently with my team, with Michael Sabia and officials. And we basically go through sort of three thought processes. Number one, is this a really huge problem that has risen to the level that we need to figure out a way to stop this? And by the beginning of that week, especially with the bridge blockade, we were coming to that conclusion. We have to figure out something to do. So then step two is, we're the Department of Finance. I think you've probably heard from other ministers. The instruction was, okay, everyone, take a look in your toolbox and figure out what tools are available to you to act on this. And so that's what we did. And we found looking at what was in the finance toolbox, that there were basically two areas where there could be authority. One was FINTRAC, which is the center that sort of monitors financial transactions, money laundering, terrorist financial activity. And then the second was the Bank Act. And would there be authorities under the Bank Act that could be useful in resolving the situation? So that was the two areas we looked at. We looked at what the existing tools available as of that moment permitted us to do. And we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that everything that could be utilized was being utilized. So then we thought, well, is there a need to legislate? And that memo outlines areas where the department said you could legislate to create this authority, or you could legislate to create these various authorities as outlined in the memo.
And did you consider those viable options then?
We definitely looked at them. As you know, I would say, let me say a couple of things. So on the FINTRAC front, what we concluded was, to put it in maybe kind of more regular terms, what we concluded, and this is something that finance officials had been thinking about for a while, is that basically the FINTRAC monitoring authorities were appropriate for a 20th century economy, but not for a 21st century economy. That FINTRAC, and I know you guys know this because you have been over this for hours and hours and hours, but maybe for people who are tuning in for the first time, FINTRAC is not an enforcement agency. The job of FINTRAC is to monitor what's going on, to both look into reports that it gets and to just kind of have situational awareness and let us know what's happening in terms of illicit financial flows in Canada. I think that's a summary I would offer you of FINTRAC's job. What we were sort of reminded of in looking at this is FINTRAC's sort of line of sight was very blinkered. They could look into what you might call the 20th century financial system, but they didn't have authority over the 21st century financial system. And by that specifically, I mean over crowdfunding and over payment platforms. So that was a lacuna. It was well known that it was a lacuna, but there hadn't been an urgency to act. And the memo identifies this is an authority that we think FINTRAC should have, and you could legislate to create that authority. Subsequently, as we all became FINTRAC experts very quickly, or thought we were becoming FINTRAC experts very quickly, we understood that regulatory authority would be sufficient to grant FINTRAC these additional powers. And as you know, that's what we ultimately did. So FINTRAC, one area. And then second area, which is outlined in this note, is could the Bank Act be used to allow the banks to effectively freeze accounts? That's basically what the memo discusses, and it discusses what would be the different authorities which would allow that. And so those were the options that were developed there. Maybe the final point worth mentioning with regard to that memo is in terms of a legislative path, what we understood was it takes a long time. And look, it's a good thing that it takes a long time for legislation to be passed in Canada. Even when we're working really together and urgently and quickly. And an example, just this fall of Parliament coming together, understanding an urgent necessity and passing legislation was the bill that granted us the authority to double the GST credit, which we proposed as soon as we returned from the summer recess. It gained all party support and it speeded through. And, we proposed it in the middle of September, and we got the first checks out to Canadians on November 5th. In parliamentary legislative time, that is a sprint. And that was good because we know that Canadians need inflation relief. But that's really, really fast from September 19th to November 5th. So, and that's just one real life example where there was urgent action by Parliament. And the Senate, and the House and the Senate. And so while we looked at what the legislative options could be, we quickly understood that they would take a long time.
So skipping way ahead now, but so the conclusion in the end was you did not have time to legislate.
Not that, I think the short answer is yes. Basically the legislative timelines and the snowballing, sort of exponentially damaging impact on the economy, they were not, the legislative timeline was not appropriate to the scale and speed with which the damage was mounting.
You mentioned in the course of that you were having conversations and you were hearing from various stakeholders and business people, et cetera. So I want to spend a moment, and also U.S. officials, obviously. So I want to spend, not actually a moment, a little while going through some of the conversations that you were having. And I think the best way to do this is with the assistance of some of the documents that we have that may remind you of the specific conversations. So we'll start with Mr. Clerk, SSM.can.401255. So this is a summary of your conversation while it's being pulled up with Mr. Deese, Brian Deese, on February 10th. And you've already explained to us who Mr. Deese is, but just maybe go over that again. So would you say he's the senior economic policy advisor to the president?
100%. I would say when it comes to U.S. executive economic authority, the most important person is President Biden, obviously, and his most important advisor is Brian Deese. And then, of course, Secretary Yellen is a very significant and, frankly, brilliant figure and player in all of this. And we were, maybe just as a quick footnote, I don't want to offend the Treasury, in talking about these EV incentives, we were very much in touch with the Treasury, both with Secretary Yellen and with David Lipton, who worked in the Treasury. They were very aware of our proposals, too, and supportive of them.
Is Mr. Deese someone you talk to often?
I try to. What was striking to me about the conversation I had with him on the 10th of February is he is a person who is very hard for Canadians to get a hold of. And actually in the fall, when we realized how significant the EV issue was, and when in my conversations with the Treasury, I really learned how important the White House and Brian Deese were, and also our ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, sort of identified to us, Brian Deese is the guy you have to talk to. And it was a real effort to develop a relationship and a dialogue with him. And an effort to always an effort to get him on the phone, to get him to answer an email. And I don't mean that in any way to slight him. He's an extremely busy person. In a way, the fact that it's hard for Canada to reach him is a good thing. It means we're a peace, order, and good government country, and they're not very worried about us. And so what was really striking to me was how quickly he got on the phone with me on that Thursday. It was instant. And while in some ways, that was as a practical matter, that was good, but it gave me a measure of how worried the White House was about this.
Okay, so let's look at the summary of the conversation you had with him, Mr. Clerk. If you can just scroll down to, so we can see that entire part of the email.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting February 10th, so this is you, Mr. Freeland, writing. You say, he called me. They are very, very, very worried. If this is not sorted out in the next 12 hours, all of their northeastern car plants will shut down. He said that he supposed that this proved the point that we'd made previously to them about how closely integrated our economies are. He did not seem to see this as a positive. He asked what he could do to help us. I said, tow trucks? Make your point about banning travel to the US for participants public, arrange a call between the PM and the president, and then you say he was aware of points 1 and 2, tow trucks and banning travel, and said he would push on both. He was supportive of the idea of a call and would try and make it happen. So can you flesh out that summary a little bit of what Mr. Deese was conveying to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, can you move up a little bit? Just, I think the second sentence, he said that this proved the point about how integrated our economies are, and he didn't seem to see this as a positive. He brought that up. And you have to kind of bear in mind, I have been bugging the guy, and Canadians have been nagging Americans since the fall. And we've been saying, guys, you don't understand Canada. You don't understand how integrated our economies are. This approach you're taking to the EVs, it's completely counterproductive for you because we work so closely together. Those parts, they cross the border 6 times. We've been saying this over and over. And so he comes back at me and he says, yeah, okay, like you've made the point. We get it. And it was a surprise to him, actually, the extent to which their car industry was dependent on the trade with Canada. But that was a dangerous moment for Canada, I felt. Very, very dangerous. Because the U.S. then and now, as part of their own soft landing from COVID, something that is happening there is a real move to protect the supply chains of the United States. The same supply chain challenges I was talking about earlier as affecting Canada affected the US. And I think we have all seen a very strong push this year by Americans to insulate their supply chains, particularly from China. I'm very worried about the semiconductors, but more broadly, COVID brought alive to them the vulnerability of their supply chains. And this was so worrying to me because I could see, really for the first time ever, the Americans having this amber light flashing in Canada. And this amber light that said to them, you know what? The Canadian supply chain could be a vulnerability too. And that's a problem for us because there are plenty of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, who would love any excuse to impose more protectionist measures on us. So that line to me, it jumped out at me. It made me really, really worried. And I really understood at that point that the danger wasn't just the danger of it wasn't just the immediate damage. It wasn't just the immediate harm. It wasn't, this plant loses 4 days of operation. The danger was, were we in the process as a country of doing long-term and possibly irreparable harm to our trading relationship with the United States? And it's also important to understand that our trading relationship with the United States, it's not just about Canada-US trade. It's about Canada's attractiveness as a destination for all foreign investments. Japanese car companies invest in Canada because of our trading relationship with the United States. So that one conversation was a seminal one for me. And it was a moment when I realized, as a country, somehow we had to find a way to bring this to an end.
And Mr. Clerk, if you just scroll up a bit so we can see the next email there. You say one final thing. He'd like to talk to me again tomorrow and every day until this is sorted out. Did that end up happening?
It didn't, because we sorted it out. So, that was a conversation on the Thursday night. You'll see from that conversation that I asked Brian to help organize a call between the Prime Minister and the President. And again, that's a very hard thing to set up. The President of the United States, the most important elected leader in the world, very, very busy guy. He also, by the way, was involved in this potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, very involved. And yet I asked for the call that Thursday. I can't remember exactly when my call with Brian happened, Thursday, sort of early evening, I think, late afternoon, early evening. The President and the Prime Minister spoke on the Friday. And then, as you know, we made an announcement on the Monday.
Okay. Just going to take you back for 1 second. Mr. Clerk, can you pull that one down and go to ssm.can 404175? So, Mr. Freeland, this is a text exchange you had on the 11th with Brian Clow of PMO.
Yeah, okay, and that's
the following day then.
That's the Friday. Yeah,
that's the Friday. And scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk, until we see Windsor was supposed to there. So you say, Windsor was supposed to happen today. This can't go on. We need to show some federal leadership too. So does that go back to what you were just saying? At that point, you had decided something had to be done and quickly.
Yes. And also, that point Windsor was supposed to be today, I think it's worth dwelling on for a moment, because it speaks to our experience in the eye of the storm, which is that we continued to hear that action was going to be taken and things were going to come to an end. And it seemed that wasn't happening. And at the same time, what seemed to be happening is we had this metastasizing of the illegal blockades and occupations. So there were sort of, copycat action across the country, sort of a whack-a-mole. And that was also worrying.
Okay, we'll go back to the stakeholders now, Mr. Clerk. Thank you. You can take that one down and pull up ssm.can 404138. So this is a text exchange with Mr. Flavio Volpe. Can you explain who Mr. Volpe is?
Yeah. Flavio is the head of the car parts group. He is a real leader in the car sector. I got to know him well during the NAFTA negotiations, where we had sort of a real Team Canada approach, and autos were a very important issue. And so Flavio and his constituent companies and the trade negotiators and I worked really closely together on the specifics of the deal. And Flavio also, significantly, I think, for this exchange, Flavio was very aware of the EV issue. And if I have seemed to you guys today to be kind of weirdly obsessed with EVs and US EV incentives, I would urge you to spend 5 minutes talking to Flavio, and you will understand how really kind of life or death for the car sector it is. So he was very, very steeped in all of these issues.
Okay, so if we just look at the text exchange, he says to you on the 9th, the Ambassador Bridge debacle is embarrassing. and then you say, let's talk tomorrow. I would love to get your ideas. I'm worried too. So the text then skips to February 14th, but we don't necessarily need to go. Well, actually, let's go there. So this is at the point, I guess, where the Emergencies Act has been involved, and you say, express to him, I know how devastating this has been, and it's been determined that we need to take strong action. We didn't save NAFTA only to have it undermined. Can you tell us about the conversations you had sort of in between these texts?
Not really, because I don't have sort of specific memory of actual things we said. And I can't even tell you 100% whether we spoke on the phone or just exchanged texts. So I don't want to pretend to knowledge of that. But, I can give you some context for that view that I expressed there, which I do remember expressing, which I think is consistent with what I've been saying earlier this morning, that all of us who had been involved in the NAFTA negotiation, very much the car sector people, but I think you'll see that I also had a text exchange with one of the steel guys. All of the industries that were very implicated in the NAFTA negotiations were aware of how Canada's access to the U.S. market was both essential and kind of constantly fragile and in need of tending. I don't know, maybe it's like a marriage, like your whole life is based on it, but you have to take care of it every single day. And these people whose jobs, whose livelihoods depended on it, really understood that. And I'm aware as I'm speaking that this might seem esoteric to lawyers. And what I really want to say is, especially for me personally, the NAFTA negotiations were kind of a bonding experience, just for me as an elected Canadian leader, with everyone who works in a Canadian car plant or a Canadian car part plant, with Canadian steel workers, with Canadian aluminum workers, with people in Regina who make pipes. I knew during the NAFTA negotiations, their jobs were on the line, and they knew it too. And all of those people across Canada, they were so great. They were prepared for Canada to take a strong position. They were prepared for the US president to insult us. They were prepared for us to take really strong retaliatory actions against the 232 tariffs, because they knew how important it was for them and their jobs and their lives. And what that text exchange with Flavio represents is me sharing with him something I know he felt too, which is this really important market access that we managed to secure just a couple of years ago. It's constantly under threat. Witness the EV incentives. And it's under threat right now. And we can't let Canada be devastated this way.
Okay, you mentioned one of the steel guys. Would that be Alan Kestenbaum?
It certainly would.
Okay, well, let's pull up then SSM.can 40's 4171. This is a text exchange you had with him on the 11th. And what he has to say is a little bit different, I think. So it's worth going through. So he sends you this and he says, "Hi, Chrystia, I hope you're well. I know you have your hands full. I'm not saying anything you probably don't know, but this is really impacting us badly now, like many others. And I fear that even worse, the long-term consequences of shutting down auto plants because of lack of Canadian parts will only convince the auto companies onshore even more and relocate supplies." Okay, this is a bit annoying because it's in 3 separate documents. So, Mr. Clerk, can you take that one down and put up SSM.can 40's 4349? record time. Okay, so that's a continuation of the text. Relocate supplies and our customers to the USA. I know it sucks politically to back down and reverse course, but it does really pay to carry on the policy, or does it really pay, to carry on the policy in support of a mandate for a vaccine that doesn't prevent the spread of Omicron and which seems to be vanishing naturally anyway. Moreover, this could create a resurgence of the right wing, just like it did in America. Anyway, I know this is a massive headache for you, but it could be solved by retreating and letting it fade away from everyone's memory. Just sharing my views, hoping the spreading disruption gets resolved quickly. Okay, and then the next one, Mr. Clerk, is your response, which is SSM.can404170. And that response is, Dear Alan, thank you for reaching out. I share your concerns. We are determined to bring this to an end quickly, and we will. So what Mr. Kestenbaum is expressing there is the same concern and a suggestion that the solution to it is to alter the public health measures. So what was your reaction to that?
For me, the salient point was the first part of his message. And, you know, I think what he says there, and he runs Stelco in Hamilton. He is American, though, and U.S. based. What he was saying at the beginning about onshoring and relocating to the U.S., that's what I was talking about earlier today. And I kind of highlight that for all of us here, just to kind of make clear to everyone that for people whose bread and butter, whose livelihoods were in the U.S. trade exposed industries, their immediate conclusion, you didn't have to think about it, the immediate conclusion from the blockage of trade was the Americans are going to respond by cutting us out. And then in terms of Alan's proposal, I didn't debate it with him. I don't think that I think that the relevant information for me from him wasn't for him to tell me what the right solution was. The relevant information for me from him was for him pointing out to me that this was a really big problem and it had to get resolved. Okay.
We're now going to skip to one of the very, very crucial days in all of this chronology, which is the 13th of February. I understand that on that day you had a call with a number of Canadian bank CEOs. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the chronology of that day in your world goes call with the bank, afternoon around 1 p.m., IRG meeting mid-afternoon, and then cabinet meeting at 8:30 at night. Does that sound right?
It does. I'm just referring to my own chronology because there was one other meeting which is relevant, which is at 2:00 that day. I had a national security meeting on Ukraine.
Okay, fair enough.
So just to give you guys a sense of how overlapping the issues were.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, if you can pull up document, I've lost my document, SSM.can 1281, please. Okay, so we're on the 13th now, and this is an email from Meredith Tyler?
Tyler Meredith.
Tyler Meredith, I'm sorry. Can you tell us who Tyler Meredith is?
He doesn't work in my office anymore, but I think his title was strategic policy advisor, a senior policy person.
Okay. And he writes, and the timestamp of this email, it's that wonky Greenwich Mean Time thing, so that means around 11:30 in the morning, I believe. He writes, "Hi, Chrystia. Everyone is confirmed for 1 p.m. A list of CEOs is at the bottom of this email. A couple of points of background for the call. The institutions are all aware we convened a call with the Canadian Bankers Association earlier this week just to check in on whether they had any advice for us in light of recent events. The message from industry, mostly speaking, that probably means from their legal counsel at the time, was we've got this under control and generally feel comfortable with the current regime. Then he says, privately, certain banks have proactively said that it might be worthwhile looking at bringing in platforms under AML, that's anti-money laundering, proceeds of crime, limiting access to payment processors. And then the last bullet is we haven't given them any indication about what's under consideration. So in all of that, it's actually the first bullet that I want to focus on most, which was this message that what had been heard from industry prior to this was, we got this. It's under control. We're comfortable with what's happening. Is that something that you were aware of, that you heard before?
So I mean, this was an extremely busy time that week. Tons and tons of stuff was happening. I had a lot of information flowing through my phone and my inbox. And I can't confirm one way or the other whether I read this specific note from Tyler. So I can't comment on this specific email. What I can say is that weekend, and you've seen sort of the disclosure of all of the messages that I sent and things I wrote down. What I can also say is that weekend, and I can't tell you the specific times, I had 2 one-on-one phone calls with bank CEOs, with the CEO of BMO and the CEO of TD, I believe at their request. That was unusual. I do, sort of as a matter of course, meet with the bank CEOs as a group every 6 months. And obviously they can and should have access to me, like they should be able to meet with me. But it usually takes a while for people's calendars to work and for the meeting to be arranged. And it's highly unusual for them to want to talk to me on a weekend. So that was significant to me that they wanted to talk to me on the phone. I spoke to both of them. I am pretty sure, 90% sure I spoke to both of them before this call at 1 p.m. on Sunday with all of the bank CEOs. And each of them expressed a high degree of concern about the damage being done to Canada and the Canadian economy, which was then reflected in the group call.
Okay, so let's have a look at that group call now. Mr. Clerk, it's ssm.can 408766. So this is about a 3-page document, Mr. Freeland. I'm just going to take you to certain excerpts of it that I'd like you to elaborate on. So the first one, Mr. Clerk, if you just scroll, there we go. We don't know who's speaking here, but whoever it is, it's one of the bank CEOs, says, the big hole in our financial system is these platforms, which are effectively money service businesses that are not being regulated as such. So that these platforms refers to the payment processors, the crowdfunding platforms?
I believe so. I mean, I shouldn't put words in the mouth of another person, but I think one of the messages that I recall came through in this call, and that, my memory was refreshed when I looked at these notes. One of the messages from the bank CEOs was kind of what finance had concluded independently earlier in the week, which is there's this whole space where financial transactions happen that no one has any line of sight to. And that is the crowdfunding platforms, or the crowdfunding platforms, the payment systems. And then I think someone also mentions crypto later on in this call.
Yeah, I think they do. That's right. So we'll just scroll down a little bit there. I'm not sure we're going to get to crypto just yet, but we are going to get to your response here where you say, I'm very prepared to come out and speak about this. This is an attack on democracy. We need to educate Canadians about this. what do you mean by this is an attack on democracy here?
So I was responding specifically to one of the CEOs whose bank had acted to freeze an account based on, this was prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It was based, as that note shows, on what the bank's anti-money laundering systems detected. And based on that, the bank rightly acted. What was a concern for me, and this did shape how we acted, was the banks being blamed for taking this action. The banks being seen as choosing to do it, as having the agency. And it was particularly a concern. And you note the mention of Fox News. The thing you have to remember about Canadian banks is many of them are significant banks in the United States as well. They are big players there, and some of them trade under their Canadian names. And so they were in jeopardy not only in Canada, but also in the United States, if they were being seen to be taking a politicized position. I didn't think that was their responsibility. I thought it was the responsibility of the government to make judgments about this.
Okay. The next concern highlighted there is Canada's reputation is indeed at risk. We need to show the world proactively that we won't let this happen again. Our trade corridors will remain open. We should think about putting the military in place to keep the border crossings moving, even after the protesters were removed, to send a clear signal. So this is about as strong a suggestion as you can get, bring in the military. And your response, though, here is couldn't agree more with those points. We must make clear that, one, we will resolve this, and two, we won't let this happen again. So can you explain your response there? And were you agreeing there that bringing the military to patrol the borders was a viable option?
No.
Okay.
It was, I mean, look, if you look at that conversation, people raised lots of different points in their commentary, and I didn't respond to every single one. Just as in my previous exchange with Alan Kestelbaum, our Stelco guy, I acknowledged his concern, but I didn't really address his public health measure point. My point there was, as I said in my follow-up, that what we need to do is, as a government, one, resolve it, two, be clear it's not going to happen again. And, you know, from my perspective, the reason I convened that call, and again, probably worth highlighting, it is highly unusual for the CEOs, like highly, like never, I mean, I've only been finance minister for 2 years, but it hasn't happened before, and I hope it will never happen again. For the CEOs of all of Canada's banks on, you know, a couple of hours' notice on a Sunday afternoon to come together on a Zoom call with the finance minister and deputy minister of finance. It's very, very unusual for them to find the time to do that. I'm right now trying to organize a meeting with them, my kind of every 6-month meeting for December. And it's the kind of thing that we sort of organize 4 to 6 weeks in advance, because these are all busy people. So that's kind of just worth mentioning. It shows their degree of concern and anxiety. Value for me of this meeting, why did I want to have it? What did I want to get out of it? 2 things. One, I wanted to hear from them, how worried were they? By that point, I was really worried. But we were contemplating, as you know, really serious action. And I needed to hear directly myself from the leaders of Canada's financial institutions did they share my level of concern? That was a very important proof point for me. So that was kind of number one. And it was important for me, for them, it was important for it to be a meeting of everyone, because that's also a measure of how worried were they, right? Are you prepared to say these things to a group of your peers? Is that's you judge your words carefully there, and you should. So number one, am I right to be as worried as I am? What do these guys think? And then number two concern was, okay, we do have some tools. How are the tools working? The people who have these tools, who are in charge of using them, how are they finding they work in practice? Those were the two things I tried to get out of the call. And it was a very useful call in terms of answering both those questions.
So maybe the next extract I wanted to point out goes to that second point. Mr. Clerk, can you just scroll down a little bit? There we go. So this is someone saying, we need court orders to act. We'd identified an individual who was an organizer who had several $100,000 move into their accounts. We flagged it to FinTrack, started work on a court order, and because of the delay of 4 hours, the money was withdrawn before we could stop it. And you say there, you ask, was the problem there a gap in the current system, or that it moves too slowly? And the reply is 4 hours was too long. And then I think underneath that there's, and let's be clear, that's the reference you were talking about, and let's be clear, they will all eventually move to crypto. Okay. A little lower down, Mr. Clerk, bottom of that page, you mentioned reputational risk. That's something you've talked about several times. Here's one of those, I think, quotable quotes. Agree with my colleagues, the reputation of Canada is at risk. Just spent a lot of time in the US last week, and we were being called a quote unquote joke by people. I had one investor say, I won't invest another red cent in your banana republic in Canada. That adds to an already tough investment perspective on Canada. Did that have any impact on that, the banana republic idea? I mean, it's hyperbolic.
Well, I mean, I believe, and subsequent conversations underscore, if I were an editor, I would ask if I were still an editor, I would ask my reporter, is that a direct quote or are you paraphrasing? And I think subsequent conversations we had show that was a direct quote. And a direct quote that a Canadian bank CEO was relaying to me that he had heard on an investment trip to the US from someone who he wanted to invest in Canada. He was trying to persuade someone to invest in Canada. And that was a heart-stopping quote for me. That was really a moment when, having already been concerned, when I really understood that what was happening was profoundly jeopardizing the Canadian economy and putting investment in Canada at risk. And, I don't expect you guys to have read our April budget, but one of the things we identify in the April budget is underinvestment as being a core problem for the Canadian economy, an Achilles heel. We don't have a high enough rate of business investment. We've done really well. I don't want to talk Canada down. Canada's fantastic. Our economy is very strong. We have a great jobs recovery from the COVID recession. But one indicator where we're underperforming is business investment. And again, that can sound like a dry thing to focus on. But a lack of business investment ultimately translates into Canadians not having jobs, and Canadians not having jobs that pay well enough to maintain a good standard of living. That's what a lack of business investment means. And that quote relayed to me really made me realize I had a duty of stewardship. I have a duty. I had at that moment a very profound duty to Canadians to stand up for them. And I'm surprised that I'm getting emotional, but I really felt it. And I felt like, the Canadian economy, it could seem like this amorphous thing. Investment, it can seem amorphous. EV incentives, amorphous. But when I heard that, I realized I'm the finance minister. I'm the deputy prime minister. I have to protect Canadians. I have to protect their well-being. It's being really, really damaged. So yeah, that was a meaningful conversation for me, and that was a very memorable quote, and for sure a spur to action.
So maybe in the end, not so hyperbolic in your view.
Well, look, I can't comment on what that investor was thinking. It's secondhand, right? That was what a bank CEO reported to me an investor said to him. But it is my job to ultimately, what's the job of the finance minister? To make sure Canadians have a good life, right? And part of how Canadians have a good life is capital is invested into the Canadian economy so they have well-paying jobs. And what that quote said is something is happening in Canada that very profoundly hurts Canadian jobs. And if you go down a little bit, you'll see, and I didn't remember this until I reread this note, I tried to kind of rally the troops there in the call. I tried to say, I can show you the line.
Just scroll down.
Yeah, please.
Okay, you can just direct.
So this is it. If the investor you speak of is American, I sort of said what I was trying to do was rally the bank CEOs and kind of say to them, you guys are playing for Team Canada. Don't take that from your investors. Don't let guys, I don't know if it was New York or wherever, but don't let those guys say to you that Canada is a banana republic. We're a great country. That's what I was trying to say there. And I was trying to say, sure, we have our problems, but, as I say there, our report card looks not too shabby. I wanted the CEOs to have a confidence in Canada and the Canadian economy so that they could relay that to investors. I put up a good, I think anyway, my objective was to imbue them with confidence because the confidence they project is important for Canada. But when I turned the Zoom off, I thought, wow, this is really serious.
Okay. The last thing I want to take you to before we put this document down is that just last little paragraph there that just came up on the screen. You say, I am very resolute in ending this occupation of our democracy, but I will never support negotiating with those who held our democracy hostage. No good thing comes of that. Can you explain that comment? You will never sanction or never support negotiating with those who hold our democracy hostage.
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it's healthy for a democracy, for any democracy, for policy to be made, at gunpoint, if you will. And that really also devalues the views and the contributions of all Canadians who express their political views and their political preferences in different ways, for example, by voting. Yeah.
Were you referring there to the vaccine mandates, to public health measures, or more generally?
Yeah, I think, again, I don't have a sort of photographic or a video memory of exactly how that conversation evolved. And in fact, I didn't remember saying this until I read it again, but I'm sure that's a faithful account. Having read this note, what I think I was referring to is a comment made earlier in the conversation suggesting that the solution to this was a change in policy on vaccines. That's what I think I was responding to.
Okay. So we're going to leave the call now. Mr. Clerk, you can take that document down and talk about the economic impact of the protests and the blockades as you saw it and what you conveyed to your colleagues on that front. So last week when your department officials were here, we went through in some detail the initial assessment they prepared on February 10th and also the eventual February 22nd economic analysis. So we're not going to go through that in detail this morning. But what I would like to take you to is, actually, this is ssm.can 5095. These are the minutes of the February 13th IRG. So we're still on the same day here, February 13th, and that was, I believe it was around, what's the time of the IRG again? The early evening, around 4 o'clock? Okay.
It says right there 4 o'clock, yeah.
Thank you. I was looking at my paper, not at the screen. 4 o'clock. So in between, you had the bank call, then you had the Ukraine call that we learned about, and then 4 o'clock is the IRG. And if you scroll down to page 6, please, Mr. Clerk. Rotate there. So you're reporting to the IRG on the economic impact, and you say the minister highlighted ongoing economic losses of 0.1% to 0.2% of the GDP for every week the blockades continue. Now we know at this point that didn't come from an internal Department of Finance analysis. I believe you were referring to something that had been reported in a Bloomberg article. Is that right?
A Bloomberg economic analysis.
A Bloomberg economic analysis.
And it was also fresh in my mind because in that bank CEO conversation, that number was also referred to by one of the CEOs. So I was aware of that Bloomberg economic analysis, and I was also aware that on the street, that was the number that Canadian business leaders and international investors were seeing and citing.
So on the street, you mean on Bay Street? On
Bay Street and probably on Wall Street too.
Okay. Did you explain to your colleagues at the IRG the source of this number?
I cannot recall whether I did or not, but so I can't remember. But, it was a very busy time. A lot of people were speaking. My objective was, in a succinct way, to convey to my colleagues who aren't responsible for the economy that this was a really serious economic impact. So I think that it was possible, say you're a cabinet minister, you don't have principally economic responsibilities. You might be seeing this mostly as about, damage to Ottawa shopkeepers. And that's really serious. I don't want to understate the human toll of that. But what I wanted to communicate was this is getting to have a macro impact that will be material on the Canadian economy. And the only other thing that I would say is, with hindsight, if anything, I feel that number, I feel that statement, if that's all I said there, I feel that statement understated the possible impact, because the real challenge was it was exponential. So as it happened, that trade blockade was effectively a week-long thing. And that's what statistics ended up recording. But had it gone on, then you would have seen not an arithmetic adding up the damage of week plus week plus week. I think what you would have seen, and why this really rose to the level of a profound threat to Canada's economy, was the exponential nature of it. That the longer it went on, the greater threat that the U.S. would lose faith in us and our trading relationship would be irreparably damaged. The longer it went on, the greater the threat that foreign investors would write off Canada.
Okay. So obviously that was a concern that you were expressing to your cabinet colleagues that day.
Probably more clearly to you right now than I did then, but I think I did communicate to them I was really worried.
Okay. So the overall economic impact, both near term and long term. We can take that down now. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The next topic I want to address with you is another concern that was being expressed around this time, which is the issue of foreign funding and foreign influence and money flowing largely, I think, up from the U.S. To fund the convoy. So, Mr. Clerk, can you pull up, please, SSM.can 401846? So this is an after the fact, so not quite after the fact, but certainly after the invocation of the Emergencies Act discussion that you're having with your departmental officials. And if we scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk. Keep going. I'll let you know when to stop. Keep going up. There we go. So this is a question that you've posed to your officials. And the question is, and do we have any info on foreign donations? And the response that comes back is, we do not have any information on foreign donations that entered our Canadian financial systems. It is possible that FINTRAC, CSIS, or the RCMP possess information on foreign donations, but that information is not shared with the Department of Finance. So is it fair to say that at the points at which foreign influence, foreign donations were being talked about, the government wasn't actually in possession of information to corroborate that?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is a couple of things. One of the things that this occupation and the blockades really brought to our attention was how little official insight we had to crowdfunding and payment platforms, how little we knew for sure about what was going on there. And we've talked about that, and we have since acted on a permanent basis to correct that. There was very good reason to believe, and in fact, the subsequent report that the commission did that I thought was very good on foreign donations documents in a lot of detail that there were foreign donations coming in to support the convoy. And so, that was happening. Our own systems were weak at officially picking that up and slow. And quite rightly, actually, there are a lot of checks and balances within the Canadian system about what finance specifically learns, right? Because law enforcement and finance operate in different silos, and certainly elected ministers and law enforcement have a lot of silos between them, and I think that's a good thing. So, yeah, so that would be my understanding of the situation.
So to summarize that, would it be fair to say you were operating with incomplete information at that? I would
100% say that. And the other thing I would say is, we were operating in the fog of war. And things were moving very quickly in real life on the ground. We had to operate based on the best possible information we could get at every single moment. And sometimes that meant using open source information. It didn't always mean relying on official government information and analysis that came through the finance channels. And I feel, not only comfortable doing that, but that's the right thing to do. In a fast-moving, hour-by-hour situation like this, you have to gather information from a lot of different sources, reliable sources. But I believe that's the responsibility of an elected minister. And if you don't do that, my experience in government has been, quite rightly, stuff that you officially get through official channels as a minister, I don't know, it's like flour that has been sifted many, many times. It's like very pure, very verified. It's gone through a lot of different hands, and there have been a lot of different checks on it. That's a good thing because it has, Government of Canada stamp of approval. And I think it's really good for us to have those systems. But at the same time, I think to do your job as a minister, you have to be aware of and actively seek out other sources of information, including open source sources of information. And I think you have to hear some things for yourself. That's, for example, why, for me, having that call with the banks directly was really, really important. And I wasn't just going to rely on other people telling me what they were hearing.
Okay, so the last thing I want to take you to on this point is SSM.can 403807. Please, Mr. Clerk. So this is a draft, Minister Freeland, of the Section 58 explanation that was reported to Parliament. I'm sure you're familiar with that, as we all are in this room right now. If we scroll down to page 8, please, Mr. Clerk. Bottom of the page, I believe. Okay, yeah, sorry, here we go. So under item number 6 there, Roman numeral. This is a paragraph in the draft or a bullet point in the draft that says there is credible evidence that significant amounts of funding for the protests come from sources outside of Canada, which raises concerns about foreign interference in Canadian affairs and questions whether they represent threats to the security of Canada. And the comment made on that underneath it is anecdotal reports of donations from outside Canada to support the protesters were given credence when on February 13th, hackers of the crowdfunding website GiveSendGo released hacked data, and it goes on to explain what happened there. But that bullet point paragraph there is credible evidence that significant amounts of funding come from sources outside Canada was removed from the eventual Section 58 explanation. Were you aware of that? And
I wasn't part of that whole process.
Okay. And do you have any comment on that at this point?
I mean, that I wasn't part of that process and of the drafting of all of that. And finance was not, we weren't the people responsible for looking at that aspect of what was going on. And, as my previous comments have kind of underscored, I think, my primary concern and anxiety around this was about the economic impact. And we've talked about that at some length, but that I felt my job was in the cabinet and as a teammate with my colleagues. What were they relying on me as the Minister of Finance to do? They were relying on me to figure out and communicate to them how big is the economic problem. And then they were relying on me to figure out and communicate to them, look, finance guys, are you doing your job here? Are you awake? Are you using all the possible tools you have to stop the problem? That was my job number 2. And then job number 3 is, okay, if you think it's a really big problem, which we did, if you think you're using all the tools which currently exist, which we did, number 3, do you have any ideas? Is there anything in the finance toolbox that could be devised that would help? That was how I understood finance's job.
Okay, so this would be more law enforcement / intelligence area. Okay. We can take that one down then, Mr. Clerk, and move on to which sort of goes back to what you were just addressing, Minister Freeland. What do we do about this? So the development and the implementation of the emergency economic measures order. So again, we've heard at this point quite a bit about the orders and about what was done with them. So I want to take you to a few specific concerns that have been expressed about them. The first one being that the EMO is overbroad. In the sense that it might capture individuals who are not really directly involved in the protests, but people who donated to the protests and or have adverse effects on family members. If you freeze someone's bank account, it may be a spouse or a child or someone else who suffers. So my first question is that a concern that you were aware of? Is that a concern that you had? And is that a concern that you felt was properly addressed within with the measures that were enacted?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. But that is kind of, I would say, core. You're getting at some core things we grappled with beforehand, during the time the measures were in force, and in our reflections afterwards. And I want to start by saying something that I was really, really worried about and extremely conscious of the whole time was, I've talked a lot about my profound conviction that Canada was in economic jeopardy. But then as we were talking about, okay, what can we do about it? I had probably an equally profound and even emotional concern of we don't want anybody to get hurt. And one of my colleagues said to me in our conversation about all of this, as we were talking constantly, and I was sort of saying, we really have to act, something has to be done. And I remember a colleague saying to me, my nightmare is blood on the face of a child. And I remember that very clearly because I was worried about that. And I really was conscious that, yes, we had to end this, but it was so important for it to be ended peacefully without anybody being hurt. So that was a hugely important objective for me. I didn't want to be a person responsible for making Canada a place where people, and you have heard by now, there were reports of children, would actually get hurt in our efforts to protect the country. That was wrong. And I felt so strongly we had to look for ways to resolve this. Yes, that was urgent, but not physically hurting anyone. And look, especially not a child, but anyone, was a really key objective for me. So that was one key thing. And that was a consideration that very much shaped the development and use of the financial measures. From my perspective at the time, and also with hindsight, a virtue of these measures was no blood on the face of a child, no physical coercion required. And I thought that it was good that we came up with a way of creating some economic incentives for people to leave. So that was a very important consideration. And a second really important consideration in this question, right? I think you're asking exactly the right question. It's the balance, right? I've talked a lot now about why it was such a big problem, why I think we needed to act. Are your actions kind of appropriate and proportionate? And I would say the other thing in my mind there was we needed to always have in our minds, yes, a concern about the number of people who would be restricted by these measures, but that always needed to be balanced against an awareness of the number of people who would be protected by this action. So those were the things that I chiefly had in mind. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, it was something like 280 accounts frozen. One of the reports I remember when we were at like 240 or 241 accounts frozen, my numbers won't be exact, but I know you guys have all the numbers too. It was something like 57 people when we were at around 240. So I don't have the exact figure of how many actual people when we were at 280, but I think we have an idea of the ballpark. And so in my mind, I say, okay, that I regret that happened to those people. I really do. I would have preferred, it was a serious thing. I would have preferred not to have had to do this. But in my mind, I weigh that against what I really believe is the tens, hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs and families that we protected. So that's kind of a high-level thing. I can talk about donations and family members if you'd like me to.
Sure. I mean, what I was going to ask you, and maybe this will lead into it, but would it be fair to say then that if it's put to you, you know, someone is at the protest in Ottawa and gets a call, you got to come home, they've frozen the account and I can't pay the grocery bill. In a sense, that is the measure doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is create an incentive for that person to have to go home and leave the protest. That is in effect exactly what the measure was trying to do, because the purpose of it was to avoid what you saw as a worse outcome, being an enforcement action that would have potentially violent aspects to it.
I wouldn't quite go that far. So, you know, had it been possible, if we lived in a universe where, you know, it was possible that a jointly held family account, the family members could still have access to it, but the person doing the illegal activity didn't, that would be great. But that's not how these accounts really work. So the intention was not to create any incentives on people who were not personally choosing to engage in this illegal activity. I accept that may have happened to some people, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was really clear, and I think broadly it worked, was to create non-violent, non-physical incentives for people to stop doing this illegal activity, which was hurting Canadians very much. And what I would also say is, you know, I would have loved it if we had made the announcement on February 14th that we are going to take this action unless you leave. Ideal outcome would have been if everyone had left that night and if none of the measures had actually had to be used. There was no desire. There was no desire to be in any way punitive. There was a desire to create non-violent incentives for people to do the right thing.
Okay. I do want to talk about the donations issue. Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, I saw you looking at me. Is that break time? Or
it's any time you like. It's Can be now or in 10 minutes. What's a good moment?
Maybe now. Might as well.
Okay, so we'll take the morning break for 15 minutes.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes.
Okay.
The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think I have about 15 minutes left in the examination, so we may actually clock in on time.
It's great.
Minister Freeland, when we left off, the next topic that we planned on addressing was the issue of donations. And to do that, Mr. Clerk, can you please pull up SSM.can 403972? And to be clear, the issue that we're getting at here is whether donations are captured, small donors are captured by the measures that were enacted. And what we've heard in the evidence was that the position taken essentially by the RCMP was this is not who they were targeting. They were targeting influencers. They weren't targeting small donors. So this is a text exchange between, I believe, two of your staffers. Can you tell us who Alex Lawrence is there?
Yes, he's my director of communications.
Okay. So the comment made here, you can just scroll down a bit, Mr. Clerk, is Freeland highly skeptical of this, thinks that the banks will have frozen some smaller accounts and we just won't know. Is that an accurate depiction of your thinking around this at the time? Were you concerned that small donors when I say small donors, I'm talking about the amount of the donation, were being captured by these measures?
What I remember being concerned about, and again, this isn't something that I wrote, it's something that Alex wrote, so I can't speak to his specific conveying of what I said to him and what I was concerned about. But once we put the measures in place, I knew this was an extraordinary action. The kind of thing that I hope only happens, once in a generation. And I knew that Canadians were very focused on what was happening and concerned about it. And it was very important for me, having taken this extraordinary step, to be as careful as possible in communicating what was happening, not to over-egg the pudding, not to stretch the truth. And I didn't want to make a flat statement that no small donors have had their accounts frozen, although I very much hoped that was the case. I didn't want to make that categorical statement unless I knew for sure that was the case, because I really did understand that we were, in terra incognita, and it was really important for us to do everything we could to maintain public confidence of Canadians in their government, including the confidence of the Canadians who disagreed with us. Maybe most of all, the confidence of those Canadians. And so my skepticism was sort of about saying to my team, if I'm going to be in question period, if I'm going to be in a press conference, I only want to assert things that are absolutely true. And the position I didn't want to be in was to take this example of donations. I'm really glad that no small donors had their accounts frozen. That was a good outcome and the one that I hoped would be the case. But I also knew that things were happening in real time. And what I didn't want to have happen was for me to go out to say categorically and reassuringly, don't worry, if you made a small donation, your account isn't going to be frozen, and then have someone show up and say, well, actually it was. Because had that been the case, and had I categorically asserted otherwise, then people who already had real doubts about our government would be feeling, wow, these guys are even lying to us. So that's where my skepticism came from.
Okay, so would it be fair to say then that perhaps the intention was not to capture small donations in the measures, but they weren't crafted in order to be able to avoid that outcome specifically, and therefore you couldn't guarantee that had happened?
Yes.
Okay. The next issue I want to address briefly is, Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ssm.nsc.can 50404? You mentioned earlier, Mr. Freeland, that one of the issues or one of the concerns you were hearing from the banks was that they were being put in the middle of this and essentially having to do there's action having to be taken on their specific parts. As a corollary to that, I hope that's the right document. If we go to the top of page 7, so there's the banks themselves, and then there's the issue of the bank employees themselves. So the people who are working there, who've now essentially become frontline officers in this particular area. You voiced this is the minutes of the February 19th IRG. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance noted that in conversations with the banks, she is hearing concerns around the safety of bank employees, especially tellers who work at branches, who may be dealing with individuals who have had their accounts frozen. So what were you conveying there? What was the concern? What were you hearing?
I was concerned about bank tellers. They are vulnerable. They're frontline people. They don't get paid that much money. They worked hard during COVID. It was important for me for them not to be exposed to any danger in all of this. And actually, one of the motivations for crafting the measures the way we did was to protect them. And you'll remember in the document we looked at from that Sunday, February 13th, a concern one of the CEOs expressed is absent a clear government instruction to the banks would be held responsible. And that was not fair or appropriate. And I actually agreed with that. And my central concern was, that some poor teller not get yelled at and be held responsible, and even be in a dangerous situation. And so that was part of the thinking behind having these measures, to give the banks at all levels, including the tellers, the ability to say, this is the government's decision. It's not my decision. If you're angry at someone, be angry at Chrystia Freeland. Don't be angry at me. And I think that's appropriate.
Okay. And do you think that worked?
Yeah, I think by and large it did.
Okay, the next topic that I want to ask you about is, as you know, part of the commission's mandate is to examine the necessity of the measures that were taken and whether the measures that were decided upon and chosen by your government were the correct measures in the circumstances. So you've identified, and obviously identified at the time, choking off funding as an important part of how to bring an end to what was going on in Ottawa and across the country, funding of the convoys, the funding of the protesters. We know that there were a number of actions being taken on that front by various actors. So in and around the time when the Emergencies Act was being considered by Cabinet, by the IRG, but by Cabinet, by the Prime Minister, a number of things had already taken place. So just to list some of them, GoFundMe obviously had shut down the the convoys campaign on February 4th. TD had, and by the way, all of these are listed in the crowdfunding overview report that you referenced earlier that I can take no credit for, but the TD had frozen accounts on February 10th, I believe. and the Attorney General of Ontario had obtained a restraint order, and the Mareva injunction process was in play and was eventually obtained on February 17th. So all this to say, there were various measures being taken by others designed to achieve a similar end, choking off the funding. And in light of that and knowledge of what was going on in that area, why did you conclude that it was still necessary for the government to do what it did with the economic measures?
It's a good question, and something that we thought about a lot and we were constantly assessing. And so one of the things I think worth bearing in mind is, sitting here today, we kind of are judging a period of time that's frozen. Whereas as we were making the decisions in real time as things were evolving. It's a real difference in perspective. And I've been struck by it myself as I have reviewed documents to get ready for today. In that real-time process, I can't emphasize too much the extent to which our preference, everyone's preference, would have been for the actions to stop the blockades and occupation without the Emergencies Act needing to be invoked. That was overwhelmingly what we would have preferred to do. It is a measure of last resort. We understood it to be a measure of last resort, and we would have preferred not to have needed to resort to it. So on the financial side of things, we were constantly looking and seeing, okay, are the tools that are currently in place good enough, effective enough? And that was one reason, from my perspective, that I convened that call of the bank CEOs on February 13th. And what you'll see in that call that we've gone over already is they were very clear that the measures were not enough. And there was one CEO there who talked about how very specifically they had identified an account, they went to get the court order, but by the time they did, just 4 hours had passed and the money had moved. And that, it is certainly consistent with my understanding of the financial system as moving faster than the legal system can move. The other concern, which was also raised on that call, which I was very alive to, was the inappropriateness of putting the onus on the banks, including the tellers that we've spoken about acting. That this had become a very politicized space, and they felt, and one of the CEOs said in that conversation on Sunday, we are being seen in taking this measure as having taken a political position. And I thought it was really legitimate for them to say, it's not our job to make a political judgment here. You are the elected government. It's your job. And it's your job to bear that responsibility.
So essentially, if this is going to happen, the government should own it, not the banks?
Yeah.
Okay. Also on the topic of necessity then, there were a variety of measures enacted, some of which were barely even used. So the insurance provisions, for instance, barely, not used at all, I believe. The FinTrack, and they ended up seeing very few reports made. How would you say, in retrospect, those measures were necessary, given that they weren't even used?
In retrospect, I am glad that we put both of those measures in there. And I can explain each one if you'd like me to.
Please.
So on FinTrack, as we said we would do on February 14th, this was the case of this crisis causing us, to review our toolbox and kind of saying, okay, we're missing a screwdriver. And it turned out we couldn't, build the screwdriver in time to use it in this situation. But we were missing a screwdriver. We identified that. And we said on February 14th, this is a gap we've identified. We're going to fill the gap. And we did, in fact, go ahead and do that. So FINTRAC now has those authorities, and that's a good thing. As it happened in this sort of fast-moving situation, the way FINTRAC works means there was a lag time between those authorities being granted to FINTRAC, not granted, being sort of put there in the measures, and that actually being actionable and meaningful in this specific case. I judge that to be a good thing because it meant that things came to an end quite quickly. But I also judge, as we judged at the time and as we said very openly to Canadians, and I don't think there's actually a lot of debate around this, that it's a good thing for FINTRAC to have this authority. So that's FINTRAC. And it was also appropriate, as was the case, that in the emergency measures, that specific extra power was limited just to the time of just to the actions in the measures. It wasn't a universal granting. We went back with regulatory changes to give that authority to FINTRAC in a permanent way. And I think Isabelle Jacques has explained that, I guess theoretically a person could say, well, why not just take that regulatory action on February the 14th or February the 15th right away rather than put it in the emergency measures. And regulation just takes longer to fully develop and to do properly. But that was always the intention, and we did it, and I think that's good. On the insurance, from my perspective, it actually is good that we put it in place, and it's good that we didn't have to use it. You will have seen in some of the previous documents you've discussed with me, and in some of previous testimony, that a huge preoccupation was tow trucks. I think Canadians will not forget Premier Kenney's comments about tow trucks, for example. And it's something that I raised with Brian Deese. It was like this serious thing, for lack of a tow truck, the economy was wrecked, right? For lack of a nail, the kingdom was lost. It was that kind of a situation. It all came down to lack of tow trucks. The insurance measure I saw and I see as like a virtual tow truck. It was specifically designed to create an incentive for the trucks to move. And I think it did. And there was news reporting at the time that suggests that some people moved their trucks because they saw the insurance measure was there. We were very public about it being there, and that created an incentive to leave. And that's what we wanted to have happen. I see the fact that it didn't ever have to be used as a feature, not a bug. Again, from my perspective, the less action we had to actually take, the less we had to actually use these measures, the better. If the measures had been effective purely upon being announced, creating a deterrent and an incentive for people to leave, and if that had happened in 24 or 48 hours and no accounts had been frozen, that would have been a wonderful outcome.
I think you've coined a phrase there. We've been at this for 7 months, and virtual tow truck is not an expression we've yet heard. But getting back to the substance of what you were saying there, would it be fair to say, or the emergency it was revoked within about a week, the declaration of the emergency. Did it end faster than you expected it to?
I don't think I can answer that question because I don't think I had any precise expectation. In a situation like that, I think you have to just hope for the best and plan for the worst. And I think that's what we tried to do.
Almost done. There's a few texts I want to take you to now that consist of some discussions you had with various people after the act was invoked. So the first one I want to pull up is ssm.can 404352, please. So this is a discussion you had with Perrin Beatty. Can you just explain for the Commission's benefit who Perrin Beatty is?
Okay, and maybe for my benefit, you can remind me what the date of this was, because I don't remember.
The 22nd of February.
Okay, thanks. Maybe you said that and I didn't.
No,
sorry. So Perrin Beatty is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. He is a person with whom I have now worked closely for a long time during the NAFTA negotiations, also during the COVID recession when we were working on our economic response. He is someone who whose collaboration I really value. Of course, because he represents the Chamber and Canadian small business, and that's an important constituency for the Department of Finance, obviously. But also because Perrin is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and in fact is the guy originally responsible for the Emergencies Act. But in his capacity as sort of a former Conservative cabinet minister, I do think that where possible, it's really good for a Liberal government to try to have good relationships, good working conversations with former Conservative ministers, to understand that point of view, to, I fully understand that we're talking now about a very strong action we took, which was polarizing for the country, or which spoke to a time of polarization in the country. But Perrin specifically for me is an example of a person with whom I work hard to maintain a relationship, because I think where we can have consensus in Canada, where we can work across partisan lines, and we can't always do that, but where we can, I think that's good for the country.
Okay, so let's see what Mr. Beatty wrote to you. So presumably you were texting him about the invocation of the act, and he writes, "Hi, Chrystia. Thanks for your note. While I'm still working my way through the implications, the financial aspects you announced seem to be the most significant additional measures that the government took under the act." And then he goes on and says, "I certainly hope that we'll see an early non-violent end to the blockades, although I am worried as I know you are. There are also lots of long-term issues we need to consider once this is over, including whether we need to take other measures that could obviate the need to use the extraordinary powers in the Act in the future, and how to repair holes in our political system. I'm particularly concerned about the radicalization of people who would normally be law-abiding." Mr. Clerk, can you now pull up, again, it's in two separate documents, ssm.can 404351, please. So scrolling down until we get to where we were. There we go. I'm particularly concerned about the radicalization of people who would normally be law-abiding and focused on going about their daily lives, glad to talk at any time. So the first thing I want to ask you, Minister, is would you agree that Mr. Beatty says the most significant additional measures taken by the government were the financial ones? Is that an observation you would agree with?
I think they were significant for sure, and effective. I'm not sure I would say they were the most significant, but I think for sure they were significant.
Okay. And the other question I want to ask is, Mr. Beatty raises the issue or the possibility of considering other measures that could be taken to obviate the need for the Emergencies Act. Do you have any comment on that aspect of his?
I think that's a question for Perrin.
Okay, fair enough. And perhaps even a question for the Commission as we head into Policy Week next week.
Perrin actually, I mean, quite seriously, I think Perrin Beatty would be a very good person to talk to about this.
Thank you. Okay.
He's very thoughtful and yeah.
Which is why you were approaching him about this and at this time. Okay, so I think that's probably enough of Mr. Beatty's observations. The other person, do you recall a phone call or a conversation with Brian Mulroney, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, about this?
I did not recall it at the time, and sort of it didn't immediately come to mind. But having reviewed my own notes, I do see that I spoke to him.
Okay, so if I pull up the notes, will you recognize the conversation? Okay, so it's ssm.can 408764. And the notation, I believe, is at page 37. There we go. So you'll have to forgive me if I butcher this in deciphering the handwriting, but Mulroney, you have conducted, I guess, yourself in such a way, and then flipping to the next page, there's not much else there. Emergencies Act, I brought it into law, so I am in favor of it. The thing, in brackets, protests are over, and then scrolling down, I'm glad I brought I'm glad I brought in that legislation. So do you have any recollection of this conversation and why you would have approached Mr. Mulroney about this?
Being perfectly honest, my recollection of the conversation is really sparked and based on having the notes. There was a lot going on. That's why I take notes. I do think actually that the conversation was mostly or was a lot about Ukraine and Russia. And Prime Minister Mulroney was the Canadian Prime Minister who recognized Ukraine and is very proud of that. And it's an issue that I talk with him about. And I have found him to be a really smart and wise advisor on it. So I do talk to him about that. And I do have a relationship with him dating back to the NAFTA negotiations, where he was a very good and helpful advisor to me and to the government.
So the date of that conversation is February 25th. So that would probably go back to your point about there were a lot of things going on at that time.
Right. Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. And I think I can't, I've sworn on the Bible what I'm about to say. I can't swear 100%, but my recollection is that conversation was actually chiefly about Ukraine and him giving me some advice, and specifically that he thought it was an important opportunity for Canada to play an important role in the world. And he wanted to encourage me and, through me, our government, not to underestimate the impact that Canada could have and the seriousness of this.
So that brings me to the very last question I want to ask you, Minister, which is, this is something that's been touched on already in the inquiry. We haven't really spoken about it yet today, but if you look at the Section 58 explanation, and I'm not going to pull it up because it's nothing specific, but in reporting to Parliament about why the Act was invoked, much of that explanation focuses on economic security and the threats to, as we've talked about today, Canada's economy that we're in. And this has been now the discussion for about 2 hours today. What is the link, as you see it, between the threat to economic security and the threat to a threat to national security? Because that link is not necessarily obvious in looking at legislation. And we would really like to hear your perspective on that question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I say that really sincerely. I think that is a really important question. And a serious and challenging one. You know, people could write books about it. Maybe someone can write a PhD thesis about it one day. But I will try to offer 2 links that are central in my own thinking and were at the time. The first is, I really do believe our security as a country is built on our economic security. And if our economic security is threatened, all of our security is threatened. And I think that's true for us as a country, and it's true for individuals. It's true for the people who work in a Windsor car plant and who, you know, in some dystopian counterfactual, let's imagine that we hadn't acted. Let's imagine that this had entirely spiraled out of control. Let's imagine that immediate trade in the car sector had been imperiled and that the Americans just sort of said, you know what, we just can't do this building of cars together with you guys. You're too unreliable. So, you know, the people who would have lost their jobs there, the people in a steel mill in Hamilton who would lose their job as that relationship fell apart, the people in an aluminum smelter in Quebec. For each of those people, having this all fall apart and the country's economy be profoundly undermined, that would undermine their security, and it would undermine our security as a country. And if that seems too abstract, I think you're seeing it today in the geopolitical space, where we're actually seeing economic tools being weaponized in actual wars. I spoke yesterday with the Prime Minister of Ukraine because we're issuing sovereignty bonds. It's a good thing that Canada is doing. It's good. But I spoke with him yesterday, and he was talking to me in the darkness because most of Ukraine's power and water had been taken out by Russian missiles. Now, I'm not saying that we're talking about missiles with Canada, but I'm saying that a tool being used to undermine Ukraine is directly going at its economy. And we're seeing something similar happening in Europe, where energy supply to Europe, entirely an economic measure, is being used to undermine Europe's security. So I do think that an attack on or an undermining of a country's economy, that can fundamentally undermine that country's national security. There's a second aspect which I was really worried about, which is maybe less kind of highfalutin and philosophical and more human and specific. And what I was worried about was, you know, it can sound very abstract to say economic security can undermine national security, to say geoeconomics is a tool in geopolitics. But actually, that's not that complicated. And I think that while these illegal blockades and occupation were going on, I think actual ordinary Canadians who do not debate these concepts in their ordinary lives were feeling their own security to be undermined and were getting really angry. And one thing that I was worried about, I've mentioned that I was worried about in the ending of these blockades and occupation. I really didn't want anyone who was part of the blockade and occupation to be hurt. Another thing that was very much in my mind was the possibility of violent conflict between people doing the blockading and occupying and other Canadians who were very angry about it. I felt that Canada was sort of a powder keg and that you could have a violent physical confrontation at any point. I didn't visit Windsor at the time, but I heard a lot of people saying, this could really get out of hand. And the people of Windsor, they really understand how important that trade over the Ambassador Bridge is. And I did really fear you could have counter protests and a confrontation there. And that would have been terrible for the people involved and terrible for our country. And I was worried in Ottawa also. And this is now just very sort of personal eyewitness experience. But I don't normally have RCMP security. And I think that's a good thing. I think that says something good about Canada. But the RCMP, they know what I'm doing every day, and it's their job to judge whether they think I need security or not. And I have to say to the RCMP officers who are here, who I recognize, they do a very good job of it, of making that judgment, I think. So a measure for me of how much Ottawa was a powder keg was the fact that I think from the end of January, the RCMP judged that I did need to have RCMP with me, just walking around. And so I didn't feel personally in danger because the RCMP were taking care of me. But I do remember one morning, and I'm sorry, I didn't write it down in my notebook, so I can't tell you the date. But I remember one morning when I was walking from my hotel to my office, I walked past a parked truck, and there was a young woman walking there too. And the truck honked really loudly. And she shouted something not very nice and made an obscene hand gesture. And the truck honked again really loudly. And I was really glad that I was there, and more importantly, that the RCMP was there, because I thought this is exactly the kind of thing. Like, imagine no one had been there. It was just this small young woman and this big truck and a person in it. And she was mad. And I just thought, there are dozens and dozens of these things happening every day. And, God forbid that one of them should actually flare into violence and physical harm. So I was worried about that too. And that does speak to the economic challenge, because many, many Canadians, while this was happening, understood that for them, this threat to Canada's economic security, for many, many Canadians, it was a personal threat to them. And they felt that their government was not protecting them. And they were right. We weren't for a while. And it was a real danger, I think, that totally understandable and reasonable feeling that my economic security is being undermined by these illegal blockades and occupation. My government isn't taking care of me. Maybe I have to take care of myself. And that would have been terrible had that happened. That's why we have a government.
Thank you, Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Okay, well, thank you. So we're now, we'll move to the cross-examination portion. First, I'd like to call on the convoy organizers for first to go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Brendan Miller, and I'm counsel to Freedom Corp, which is the representative of the protesters that were in your city at Ottawa in January and February 2022. So, ma'am, I understand the mandate regarding truckers that led to the protest. It came into effect on January 15th, 2022. Is that correct?
I don't recall the exact date, but I'm prepared to believe you are citing it correctly.
And during the pandemic, from March 20 through January 15th, 2022, there was no such regulation, right?
Again, I don't recall the exact dates myself, but I do know we didn't have the mandate and then it came into force.
Right. And just so the folks at home understand, a regulation is a different type of law. It's passed by the executive branch alone, not by all of Parliament, right? Like the Emergencies Act.
There is absolutely a distinction between things a government can do by regulation and things it can only do by legislation.
Right. And so would you agree with me that given that during the throes of the pandemic, from March 2020 through to January 15th, 2022, and we had no regulation, you didn't need one?
No, I believe that taken as a whole, the public health measures that Canada put in place were very, very important in protecting the health and safety of Canadians.
I only have so much time, so I'm going to cut you off there. And you'd agree with me that given that there was no regulation in place from March 2020 through January 15th, 2022, during the throes of the pandemic, there was no reason to pass one on January 15th, 2022, was there? There was no health risk.
No, I'm afraid I don't agree. In January, we had an Omicron wave. We were still fighting COVID, and there was a real value in encouraging as many Canadians as possible to get vaccinated.
So the purpose was to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated, to compel them to get vaccinated. Is that fair?
That's right.
All right. So that was the purpose of the regulation. That was the true purpose. It wasn't to keep people safe. It was to get them vaccinated.
I believed then, and I believe now, that creating strong incentives for Canadians to be vaccinated protected the health of vaccinated Canadians and protected the health of our country overall.
Okay. So from March 2020 to January 15th, 2022, did you fail to protect Canadians by not having that regulation?
Let me start with one aspect of that timeline, which is obviously when COVID first hit us, vaccines didn't exist. And then even when vaccines arrived, it took time for them to be distributed. So, of course, vaccine mandates couldn't be put in place before vaccines existed or were made available.
So, and of course, the government, you ended up creating a vaccine compensation fund in December of 2020. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Right. And you're aware that Quebec had a vaccine compensation fund and it was the only province that actually had one prior to that?
I am prepared to accept that that's the case. I can't recall specifically.
And can you agree with me that the United States has a federal vaccine compensation fund?
Again, I'm prepared to accept that that's the case.
So from 1867, when Canada was founded, up until December of 2020, Canada had no federal vaccine compensation fund. Can you agree with that?
Again, I'm not an expert in the history of vaccine compensation funds in Canada.
But the first you can agree the first compensation fund in Canada for vaccines came about only because of the COVID vaccines, correct?
Again, I'm really not an expert in vaccine compensation funds. If the direction of the question is to suggest that the COVID vaccines are more dangerous in some way than previous vaccines we've used in Canada, I'll say one, I'm not a health expert, but I believe very much in really the advice, the effectiveness, the thoroughness of Health Canada. They're very good at judging the safety of vaccines. And I will say, I have been vaccinated 4 times. My children have been
I understand,
vaccinated.
ma'am, I don't need to know that. But
But it does speak to my confidence in the vaccines.
I
If I've
understand.
had my children vaccinated, it speaks to my
Ma'am,
belief that they're
Please
safe.
stop talking out the clock and let me ask my questions, okay? So,
Well, it's a bit of a trade-off. You make a statement and you say, do you agree? And she qualifies the answer.
Yeah.
That's appropriate.
okay. So, ma'am, if that's the case, then did Health Canada advise you to enact this regulation?
The mandate,
Yeah.
again, I'm not the health minister, and I'm not going to speak to specific moments that we had advice.
Okay.
But what I will say is we were very careful and thoughtful throughout COVID in the public health measures that we
Okay.
put in place and acted based on advice of PHEC.
Right. And so that mandate was only in place until June of 2022, right?
Again, I can't recall the specific dates,
Okay.
but I'm prepared to accept
So-
what you're saying.
We're going to move on and to just another area. I take it you know who Tamara Leach is, right?
I don't know her personally, but I have read about her.
Yeah. And you know who Chris Barber is?
Again, I don't know him personally, but I've read about him.
Yeah. And you know who Tom Marazzo is, right?
Can you say the third name?
Tom Marazzo, the gentleman over there?
I can't say that I know as much about him or I've heard as much about him.
And what about Danny Bulford? You know who he is, correct?
What was that final last name?
Danny Bulford, he used to be with the security team for the RCMP with the Prime Minister.
I'm afraid I'm not
Okay.
so familiar with that final name.
So,
Tamara Leach and Chris Barber I've heard of, yes.
and when you were making your decision with respect to invoking the Emergencies Act, you'd already heard about Tamara Leach and Chris Barber?
I had heard of their names, yes.
Yeah, and there's some discussions about them in some of the records. There was issues, you knew who they were.
I had read their names in the media.
Yeah, and you knew about that before you invoked the Emergencies Act.
Again, I can't say 100% not having reviewed what I read, but my recollection is they were reasonably prominent. And so I think it's reasonable to think that I would have read their names.
And of course, you know Tamara Leach, she's a Canadian.
Again, I haven't familiarized myself with her
Okay,
biography
and
before
she's-
coming here.
She's from Alberta. Do you know that? Where you're from?
I really haven't studied about her before coming here. I want to be careful that I say things I know for sure are true. I am certainly Canadian, and I'm born in Peace River, Alberta.
Okay. Is Tamara Leach a terrorist?
In terms of designating who is a terrorist and who isn't, that is not my job as Minister of Finance or Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay.
We have authorities whose job is to do that.
Right. And so it's not your authority to designate Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, Tom Marazzo, or Danny Bulford terrorists. That's somebody else has to do that.
Yes, we have intelligence services. We have enforcement agencies whose job is to determine who is a terrorist, and
Okay,
that's
so
entirely appropriate.
Can I bring up?
Can I say
document-
one thing about that?
Yeah, just a second. If I can bring up document SSM.CAM.00008764_rel.001, please. And you can, while he's pulling that up, if you want to add to your answer. Okay, if we can scroll down to page, I believe this is a note with Dave. What page? 12, page 12, please. And this is a note that I understand you wrote with Dave from CSIS. That's 11. And this is a meeting with Dave from CSIS. And if you scroll down, keep going. Okay. And there you say that you need to designate the group as terrorists. So, but it's not your job, but you wanted to designate them as terrorists, right?
So that handwritten note in my notebook. I can assure you that was not a meeting with the director of CSIS, with whom I didn't have a meeting.
It says, it's, okay, it's with David Vignon from CSIS.
It doesn't say that. It says it's with a gentleman called Dave.
Which Dave?
That meeting, that is not an account of
Which
a
Dave?
meeting with Dave Vigneault because I didn't have a meeting
which Dave is in
with
those
the
notes,
CSIS
ma'am?
director.
Which Dave is in those notes? What's Dave's last name?
I need to see my whole notebook that you're referring to, but I can tell you for
It only
certain.
says Dave.
I can tell you for certain that I did not have a meeting during this time with the CSIS director.
Okay, so
I can exclude that 100%.
I'm just going to, this isn't a document, I don't need to bring it up, but you stayed in the House, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite has just used the bad apple excuse. She has excused the desecration of the national. Yes?
My friend is saying he's referring to something that the Deputy Prime Minister said in the House.
Yeah.
There's an objection there for parliamentary privilege.
This is a parliamentary commission. There is no parliamentary privilege.
It does exist. Parliamentary
oh,
privilege does
absolutely,
exist.
It does exist, but because this is a report to Parliament pursuant to the case I gave you earlier in McIver, it doesn't apply. You can actually ask all of it because we're carrying out a parliamentary function and there's no liability here. It's just a report to Parliament, and the Federal Court of Appeal has agreed.
I'm not aware of that.
I gave you the McIver case quite a while ago when we talked about the objections, and I think, yeah, it's there.
Well, I'd ask my friend the document that he's referring to so that we know what he's talking about, so we can understand the parliamentary
This is
privilege
just a statement from the Deputy Prime Minister in the House. And Mr. Speaker, the members opposite have, this is what it says, use just the bad apples excuse. She has excused the declaration.
I think we're going to have to sort this out because I don't think at this stage, and I apologize, I'm not as familiar with you as you are about that case, and clearly the Crown is not either, the government, so I think we're going to have to find that. So I'd like you to hold that
Okay, I'll come back to
question.
it. But you do recall, ma'am, that you had expressed concerns publicly with respect to desecration to national monuments. Is that fair?
I'm going to
Ottawa?
need advice from my counsel on whether things I said in Parliament I should be speaking about.
Okay,
I'm
so
not
here,
an
I'll
expert
move
either,
on. It's
so.
okay. So one of the things that happened during the protest in Ottawa dealt with the national monument, the Terry Fox statue. Do you remember reading about that?
I do. Yes, I do remember the Terry Fox statue. I remember discussing it with my children.
Yeah,
Who were
and-
very upset.
Yeah, and there was, in that Terry Fox statue, they put a hat on Terry Fox's head and then put a flag in his arm. And then there was a mandate freedom sign on it.
I don't remember specifically how the Terry Fox statue was
Yeah.
implicated in this, but I do remember
Okay.
reading about it, and I remember it specifically because my children were aware of it and
Okay.
were upset.
Right. And so I went online and I just looked at how many times someone's done that to that statute, and it seems to be hundreds. So I'm just going to put this one to you. If someone puts an LGBTQ flag on the Terry Fox statute and flowers in the statute, is that a desecration?
I am not going to go into, I really don't think it's my job or helpful for Canadians for me to go into a discussion of what is okay and not okay.
But
to
you've
do
said
with
it
the
was a
Terry Fox
desecration.
statue.
When you've called it a desecration in public, that was what you're referring to, based on what was put on the statute. So is it fair to say that it's only a desecration to you if you don't agree with the message?
Again, you've made a couple of leaps beyond anything that I've said.
That's okay, it's the public record. With respects to, you had said you had concerns for violent actions and interactions with respect to protesters, and I take it that was nationally? You had concerns nationally? Or was it just Ottawa?
I described in my testimony a moment ago 2 specific areas where I had concern. I was worried about the potential for conflict between angry people in Ottawa and the occupation. Can I finish the answer? Because I have something to add. And as I said in my earlier testimony, and I believe the mayor of Windsor shared this concern, I was concerned about the possibility of that kind of a conflict in Windsor. And I was concerned about the situation in Coutts,
Okay.
which we heard about at the IRG
Right.
on this Saturday.
Okay, so, but with respect to the interaction with protesters, I don't know if you heard the testimony of the mayor there, but he said that 75% of his small town supported the blockades and that many of the properties have F Trudeau flags all over them. So you wouldn't have concern with that specific protest, would you?
My reference to Coutts just now was very specific. At the IRG on Saturday, the 12th of February, the RCMP commissioner raised with us the possibility that there were weapons there. And
Right.
that was a source of great concern.
Right, and so you can agree that police investigate weapons offenses all over the country every day.
Again, I'm not a police expert, but that seems like a reasonable common sense observation.
So simply because the police know a weapon is somewhere, you can agree with me it's not a national emergency.
The concern about a single weapon somewhere in Canada, and as you say, I think that one weapon being investigated somewhere in Canada, if that were to happen today, certainly.
Right, and you had testified earlier about what you viewed as, ensuring that we as Canadians have a good international reputation so that people come to our country and want to do business with us. Is that fair?
Yes, that's something I was very concerned about.
Okay, and I take it when you consider those sort of things, you look at various reports, and I'm sure you look at various indexes, and I'm sure you look at the Transparency International Index. Is that fair?
I am familiar with the Transparency International Index, but I haven't looked at it recently.
Okay, well, since 2019, we've began to fall. All right? And we have now come down out of the top 10, and it continues to decline. So can you agree with me that Canada not being transparent hurts our relationship internationally?
I have to say that I disagree with the premise of the question. I think Canada is a very transparent democracy. And in fact, the commission that we're part of right now is a part of Canadian transparency.
Right.
That's why it's important.
And on that point, if I told you that there is a whole bunch of unlawfully redacted documents that we've been fighting over and we're waiting for an order just to get them today, and we haven't had them for this whole proceeding, do you think that's transparent?
Again, and with apologies, I can't agree with the premise of the question. I think that, but what I can say is, I think that the fact that this commission exists, that these hearings are being held, that they're public, is really important for Canada and is a measure of Canadian transparency.
Right. And one of your concerns, of course, with transparency and our reputation, was that you would want your government to be as transparent as possible, right?
Again, here, I do believe that transparency and accountability are important, but I also recognize that cabinet confidentiality in many issues needs to be preserved for a reason. And, there are areas where transparency is not appropriate, and I recognize that as well.
Okay. Can you agree with me if, anytime it comes out that the Canadian government has misled Canadians on something, it really hurts our international reputation, doesn't it?
I think that the Canadian government should always seek not to mislead Canadians.
Right.
First and foremost, because that's wrong, and that is not the way we should treat Canadians.
And in the many statements that have been said by all the politicians in this matter, one of the main things they talked about, and Justin Trudeau did particularly on the following the first weekend of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, was these horrible, the Nazi flag and all those things that people saw in Ottawa. You heard him say that?
Again, I have to say, prior to coming here, I have not specifically reviewed specific statements of the Prime Minister. If you want to point to a specific one, maybe we could discuss it.
You'd agree if it turned out those flags were linked to your government. That would look really bad for our international reputation, wouldn't it?
Based on some...
Okay, next, if I could call on the CCLA, please.
Good afternoon, Minister Freeland. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I'm counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Minister Freeland, I'd like to start off with going back to your testimony in chief with respect to the Ambassador Bridge. If I understand your testimony correctly, you stated that the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge escalated matters in your mind significantly. That's fair?
So first of all, good afternoon, Ms. Krajewska. Nice, well, maybe I shouldn't say nice.
Maybe you can tell me that later.
Yeah, but good afternoon, and I will try to answer your questions. And I think when you say testimony, you're referring to the
your
2
exchange
hours
with Ms.
this morning.
Chowdhury.
So try to be precise, yes, as finance minister, in my judgment around the economic impact of the illegal blockades and occupation, certainly the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was a very significant escalation.
Right, and precisely the words you just used now, it was at least at that point, if not earlier, that to your mind, the blockades and the demonstrations became illegal.
No, I don't think I want to be so precise about that. What I am very clear about is the blockade of the bridge made this a real economic crisis for Canada. And that was a moment when, as finance minister, I really had to figure out a way to stop the harm to Canada from getting worse and from really snowballing and irreparably damaging our country.
And you said because it had potentially exponential harm to the Canadian economy.
Yes, I wasn't taking notes of what I said, but I believe that.
Yes. And that's when you started looking at the Bank Act and the PCLMFTA as potential, using the measures under that legislation to stop those demonstrations.
Again, here, let me be sort of very precise about my state of mind. From my perspective, we had a number of different, but certainly inspired by one another, occupations and blockades across the country. There was the occupation of Ottawa, and I can't tell you the chronology of them. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But so there's the occupation of Ottawa, there was Coutts, there was Emerson. In terms of economic impact, the Ambassador Bridge was the most significant. There was also, I believe, Sarnia, Niagara, and Surrey. So from my perspective, what was happening was this kind of metastasizing whack-a-mole copycat events around the country. And some of them had a greater specific economic impact than others. The Ambassador Bridge sort of stepped up the impact, but it was not the case, in my view, that this was just the Ambassador Bridge.
And that was not the purpose of my question, that it was only about the Ambassador Bridge. I understand your evidence that the blockades generally had a significant economic impact on Canada that you were concerned about. That's fair.
Again, can I say yes and offer an explanation?
I'm not trying to make this controversial or to trap you. I'm just trying to establish this to move on to my next point.
Okay, well, I would just say you are a lawyer, so a person does have to be careful.
Yeah.
But and I say that with the greatest respect for all the lawyers who are here. But look, the point that I just want to be clear about, and I do think that there has been in some of the public thinking about this a lack of clarity, is from my perspective, one way that you could look at the economic harm was what happens every day arithmetically and just add it up. From my perspective, that grossly understates the potential economic harm that was being done. Because what I was really worried about was that as this goes on, every single hour, more damage is done to American confidence in us as a trading partner, and more damage is done to us as an investment destination. Witness the Banana Republic comment.
Right, and exactly. So you were concerned that this economic disruption was painting Canada as politically unstable, not a place that is safe to invest for, and potentially a Banana Republic, which by definition is an unstable country.
I mean, Banana Republic wasn't my term, but it was a term that had an impact on me for sure.
Okay. Now, Minister Freeland, you can appreciate that from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, our concern is that the Emergencies Act should not be used to quash political dissent. You understand that?
I totally do. And if I can be personal for one moment, in my life as a person and a writer and an elected politician, I would always prefer for myself to be on the same side as the Civil Liberties Association. These are values I hold very dear. And so I understand the urgency with which you champion them.
Right. So I think you would also agree that the Emergencies Act should not be used because demonstrators are disagreeing with government policy. I think that's a very low threshold here that I'm putting to you.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
And I think you also know in your life, both as a journalist and as a minister, that on occasion, the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression includes actions that are of civil disobedience.
I do recognize that sometimes happens. And I also recognize that laws are enforced against people committing acts of civil disobedience. People can believe in something and can bravely commit those acts and pay the price of the legal penalty.
And exactly. And civil disobedience will on occasion also involve serious economic disruption. And I'll give you a few examples. A general strike is a form of civil disobedience that causes economic disruption. You'd agree with that?
If the tendency of these questions is to equate the economic harm that was being done to Canada and that would have risen had these illegal occupations and blockades continued with the harm done by a general strike, then I strongly disagree.
Okay. And sometimes blockades by Indigenous people cause economic harm, correct?
They do.
And sometimes occupations like Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Toronto may cause economic harm.
Certainly, but the economic harm, to take those two specific instances, very, very limited actually compared to the damage being done to Canada. And if I may, had what was happening in Canada been about, I don't know, the field behind the National Art Gallery being occupied for a long time, and maybe some comparable public park in Windsor being occupied, and so on across the country, that would have been entirely legitimate protest. But that wasn't what was happening.
Okay, maybe I can take you to an example closer to home. For me, when Solidarity had a general strike in Poland and blocked the ports, Western democracies applauded that action. That was economic disruption was viewed as a legitimate form of political protest at that time.
I'm going to allow myself one personal comment, which is I did make a bet with myself that you and I would end up talking about Solidarność.
Yeah, coming from the Eastern Bloc, it was going to happen.
Yeah, I am aware of that. And I don't think you'll be surprised to think that I thought about that at the time. And more recently and more specifically, I thought about the Maidan in Ukraine. And when we took this action. And let me talk about a few differences. And the main one is this. Solidarność, as you know very well, was a protest against a government that was illegitimate. That was from whence it drew its power and legitimacy. This was people rising up against an authoritarian, and I would even say in the case of Poland, colonial regime.
Okay.
In Canada, what happened was a democratically elected government that was actually acting on policies that we had campaigned on just that summer. So it was a fresh democratic mandate. There was no lack of transparency with the people of Canada. And people who disagreed with those policies were holding the country's economy hostage.
Okay, Ms.
And
Freeland,
that was not appropriate.
I do want to raise a concern. I'm assuming you're not saying that democracy only operates at the time of casting our ballot. Obviously, I think you acknowledge that we are able to protest in between those times. So even after you were democratically elected, people could protest your government's policies, correct?
100%. And I am in no way suggesting that the act of protest is anti-democratic. On the contrary, the right to protest, I think it's a feature, not a bug of democracy. But what I was saying, which I believe very strongly, is there is a big difference between acts of popular resistance and even revolution against an authoritarian regime and protest in a democracy.
And Minister Freeland, I'd like to just take you to, you started your comments this morning as well with the bigger geopolitical issues here between President Putin trying to demonstrate that his way of dictatorships is preferable to Western democracies. And I think you can appreciate that there have been countries in the world that have said, you should invest in us because we are politically stable. We do not have general strikes. We do not tolerate dissent. And I want to end on this. Surely you agree that in Canada, which is a democracy, the right to protest, the right to demonstration must be sedulously protected, and that economic security does not trump those rights.
So many things packed in there.
I know, I'm running out of time, so it's all going in.
So many things packed in there, and many of them I agree with. I have reported on a lot of authoritarian regimes that spoke about their stability as something that should be attractive to investors. And clearly, I strongly disagree with that argument. My concern when it came to the economic security of Canada was about our ability not to not have political debate. Political debate is a sign of a healthy society. The fact we're having this commission, that's a healthy democracy. The fact that in question period we yell at each other, I really don't like it, but it's a sign of a healthy democracy. What was undermining of Canada's economic security sufficiently dangerously that I believe we needed to act, and it was the right thing to do, was that our trade was being stopped and was being seriously blocked. And I was very worried that that was handing arguments to U.S. protectionists who were already on the move, and that had that relationship been seriously damaged, that would really hurt Canada.
And Minister Freeland, my last point, you mentioned at some point that it would have been one thing for the protesters to stand with a placard at the War Museum and protest. You mentioned that today in testimony with me.
I didn't say War Museum and I didn't say placard.
Sorry.
But the basic idea, I think we're in the same
I'm sorry,
zone.
I'm thinking of a different Ottawa monument. But you agree that public assembly and the right to protest goes beyond simply me standing on a green lawn in front of a government building, that it does encompass more than that, and that Canada should protect that to be a vibrant democracy.
I, am not going to right now try to define with you specifically, what is, give examples of protests. But what I will say, and I really agree with, and I think one of the lines that were very much in my mind in this decision is, I do agree with you that in a democracy, the right to protest is important and has to be protected. And that's such an obvious statement, and I agree with that. And I agree, since it's obvious, I'll say it and I won't gild the lily.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Commissioner Rouleau.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I don't know if the Canadian Constitution Foundation wants to start or...
Lunch, but I'm in your hands.
I don't know. I think we'll adjourn for lunch. How's that?
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we'll come back.